Okay, everyone. It is just after 6:30, so we are going to get started. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Welcome to tonight's talk, Extinction in Two Acts, The Life and Death of the Carolina Parakeet. Before we get started, I just wanted to let you all know that we have many more exciting virtual events coming up in the next few weeks, including our annual Horseshoe Crab Festival, a mayoral candidate forum focused on nature and equity, and last but certainly not least, our spring fundraiser, Cooper and Cooper in Conversation, featuring CNN anchor Anderson Cooper and NYC Audubon's very own Chris Cooper. You can check out our website for events in the chat in just a little bit, so you can check that out. Throughout this evening's talk, please be sure to use the Q&A function in Zoom to submit any questions you have, and we will try to answer them all at the end, or Kevin will answer them. You should be able to find this function at the bottom of your Zoom screen or wherever your control panel for the webinar is located. Please use the Q&A rather than the chat, as it will help us keep track of your questions better. Tonight's speaker, Dr. Kevin Burgio, is New York City Audubon's new Director of Conservation and Science. He is a U.S. Air Force veteran who received his PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of Connecticut. After he finished his PhD, he spent 2 years as a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Connecticut in science communication, followed by a year at the Carey Institute for Ecosystem Studies as its undergraduate research program coordinator and research specialist. And most recently, Dr. Burgio has been a postdoctoral research associate with the Environment and Climate Change Canada, exploring how climate change has affected populations of North American bird species. And he has many other wonderful credits to his name, but I would like to welcome Dr. Kevin Burgio to our talk tonight.
Thank you, Danielle. And thank you everybody for coming tonight. Today we're going to talk about Carolina parakeets. And before I get really into it, I would like to thank all of the people who provided, or agencies that provided funding, and all of my co-authors for helping me along this journey over the last 10 years studying this iconic species. So before we get into the birds themselves, I wanted to talk a little bit about why parrots. People often ask me why I studied parrots for my dissertation. And you can see here is a photo. This is me back when I was about 8 years old. And I had a parrot named Mojo, who is a Timna gray, which is the smaller African gray species. So from a young age, had really been into parrots. But rather than going to college right after high school, I joined the Air Force and spent 6 years as a combat medic and dental tech. For me, I grew up in a fairly poor family, and I was only the second person to finish high school, and no one in my family had gone to college before. So college to me didn't really seem reasonable or realistic, really. So I joined the Air Force, but I never, despite losing my hair and my eyesight, I never lost my love for parrots. So when I eventually did go to undergrad in my late 20s, I was looking for a research project, and I happened to run into a flock of monk parakeets on the coast of Connecticut. And I thought, wow, that was really weird. And I started thinking about and learning more about them. And, you could see from this photo here, you have a bunch of monk parakeets. This photo is taken in Brooklyn and hanging out in the snow. And the idea that these parrots live in the snow really kind of upended my expectations of what parrots are. I always thought of parrots as these tropical species hanging out in palm trees and all that. But seeing them around here just really kind of blew my mind. So I started reading more about them, and I did my undergrad research project on them. But one of the things that people kept asking me about is Carolina parakeets. And before I started doing this, I had no idea that the Carolina parakeet ever existed, and that, the US had an endemic parrot species. So, and I started hearing about it because people said, oh, we should leave the monk parakeets alone. They're just taking up the niche that the Carolina parakeet used to have here before they disappeared. And I thought, maybe, I don't know. That doesn't, maybe not all parrots are the same. So it's possible, I guess, but I don't know. So I started reading more about them. And one thing that I read that really kind of really like intrigued me was this particular story that I'm about to tell about these Carolina parakeets that landed in Schoharie, New York in 1779 during the Revolutionary War. So here's Schoharie, present day. It's in the Mohawk Valley. It's a very pastoral, beautiful place. But back then, it was the people that lived there were these people from Germany who are extremely religious people. And everything there was agriculture. And they grew a lot of the crops that fed the revolutionary soldiers. So in 1779, they were all just hanging out, and a group of Carolina parakeets landed on one of the houses there. And, instead of just breaking out the binoculars and texting the rare bird alert that these amazing birds just landed here randomly, they instead went in the opposite direction and thought that the Carolina parakeets were the harbingers of the apocalypse, like they were the fifth horseman of the apocalypse. And they were legitimately scared. This is recounted in a couple of different places, that they really thought that the end times were coming because of this beautiful tropical looking bird just randomly showing up one day. So fast forward to October of the next year. So this is 1780. And you see here, this is Sir John Johnson, who is a British loyalist, who was commanding the King's Royal Regiment of New York. So he came down with a bunch of troops from Canada and basically set fire and blew everything up in the Mohawk Valley because he wanted to destroy the crops that were feeding the troops. And it just so happened that when he got to Schoharie, the first house that he burnt down was the same one that the Carolina parakeets landed on. So to the people living there, that was further proof that, so they're sitting there and they're huddled in this fort here you can see on the screen, and there's a wooden barricade around it, and everything's on fire, everything's exploding. And you can see here on the right of this, there's a hole in the side of the building here. That's still there. That's a cannonball during that attack. And you can see below the actual cannonball that they pulled out of the wall in 1830 and kept it, which is still in the museum at this place called the Old Stone Fort in Schoharie. And, so they're sitting there and they're surrounded by fire and explosions. And to them, that was like, this is it. This is the apocalypse. It's all over. Well, clearly it wasn't. But that story really intrigued me, and I started reading a lot more about Carolina parakeets. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I learned about their basic biology, and then I'll start talking about my research. So, despite, the 19th century ornithologists like Audubon and Wilson that wrote about Carolina parakeets, we don't really know a lot about them because they were not really well studied before they went extinct. So they were largely known as a habitat specialist, though some debate that, where they specialized in this bald cypress swamp, which you see here on the screen, or hardwood bottomland forest in the western part of their range, like around rivers. And so because most of them were seen in these habitats, people thought that that's all they lived in. They were specialists of these habitats. There were two subspecies of the Carolina parakeet. You have the carolinensis, which was the eastern subspecies, and the ludovicianus, which was the western subspecies. And the differences are mostly in their coloration. But the coloration is not a very great determination of their subspecies, because some that look like they're ludovicianus were found in Florida, and some of the carolinensis were found in Nebraska. So it's not a hard and fast designation. So here we see a map This was published in 1891 of what the author considered their original range, which you see here is, goes around here. And you could see that the author had felt that the Carolina parakeet had a very healthy respect for state boundaries, as you can see here, never venturing into New Jersey or Connecticut or Massachusetts, just going up to the line, but that's it. So obviously what he did was just drew a big line around the entirety of where he thought they were historically based on some sightings. And the darkened areas you see here are areas where he thought they were in 1891. So, however, like Carolina parakeets were never seen in the mountains, either the Ozarks or the Appalachians. So I was thinking, I'm like, this doesn't seem right. And in addition to that, using this basic size range, this range here makes the Carolina parakeets one magnitude higher in range size than any other parrot species that has gone extinct. So it all seemed pretty suspect to me. So I started thinking about, oh, sorry. So here's when we're thinking about the two subspecies, the western subspecies is here over on the western side of the Appalachians, and the eastern subspecies here is on the eastern side of the Appalachians. So it started thinking about like, okay, well, we have this map, but I don't think it's very accurate. So what really was their range? Being that I was stationed in Nebraska in the winter for 3 years, when I was in the Air Force, I was like, it doesn't seem like a good place for parrots. In fact, if I could leave the Omaha winters, I would have. So I was wondering, there's the red-headed woodpecker, who many of you are probably familiar with, have a very similar range to the Carolina parakeet. And in the winter, they undergo this shift from the northwest into southeasterly out of the Midwest part of their range. So I wondered if the Carolina parakeet had a similar range shift. And another one is, when did they go extinct? There's a bunch of different numbers out there, and there's sightings that go up until potentially the 1940s, though presently the official date is like 1920 or something like that. So I was just curious, when did they actually go extinct? And then the question everybody asks me is, how did they go extinct? So I was thinking about like, okay, so how could I possibly answer these questions? So in my reading, like the thing about Schoharie, I started reading about, this is Lewis and Clark here, the famous Lewis and Clark. And I was reading their travel diaries because they reported seeing Carolina parakeets. So I was reading their diaries, and I found they were talked about observing a flock of Carolina parakeets in 1805 in this place called the Mahar Village, which is a tribe of the native peoples. And they had very explicit description of the location. So I thought about, like, I wonder if I can go and find the geographic coordinates of the spot and then collect data this way. So I did. There's this program here called Geolocate, which natural history museums use to help figure out where the specimens they have in their collection were collected. But I decided that maybe I'll start using it on just written descriptions of localities. So this particular sighting of Lewis and Clark here is, I actually found exactly where it was. And you see this circle around here is just kind of the circle of uncertainty. Like the actual village could be somewhere in this circle, but these are the geographic coordinates. So so once you have this type of information, you have geographic coordinates, you have measurement of uncertainty, and you have a date, you could start building models. And so I collected a ton of data, reading historical accounts of the Carolina parakeet from the late 1500s all the way up to 1944. And in doing so, I was able to find enough information of over 400 observations written in books, some in musty old books somewhere, or in travel diaries, And I also went through all the natural history museums specimens that are online and found over 460 specimens that I was able to find really good coordinates for. So here's a map from one of the papers I published on this, showing all the observations and all the specimens in my data set here, and with a measurement of uncertainty, which is this little, this circle with the little lines through it. So here's all the data I collected, and it took me a long time to do this. And but when start using these type of data to model distributions or anything like that, you have to clean it up. So so you can't just use it all. I mean, you could, I guess, but you shouldn't just use all the data you could collect because, for instance, the up here is Schoharie up in this area, and I removed that from the data set because, like seeing a snowy owl in Bermuda, just because you see one there doesn't mean it's actually part of its range. It's just kind of like a weird, eruption year, or food was scarce that year and they were just trying to forage wherever they could. So I removed any likely migrant sightings or a lot of egg hunters from the 1800s and early 1900s would collect eggs of other species that looked like Carolina parakeet eggs to sell them to people because they knew the Carolina parakeet was rare or going extinct. So some of those were kind of suspect. And I also removed all of the data that had a lot of uncertainty around it, because once you add a lot of uncertainty to it, your models start not performing very well. So after all that, over 800 observations and specimens, I was left with about 150, which was really hard to deal with after spending like a year collecting all the data. To essentially throw out most of it was pretty painful, to be honest. So using that data, I wanted to build what's called a species distribution model, or some people call them environmental niche models. And essentially, what all these models do is they take all the sightings you've ever had of that species, and it basically takes an average of all the conditions in that particular area. So what you're looking at here is a climate norm, which I created from climate data or weather data from the late 1800s to early 1920s, and averaged them all so into different data sets. Like this one here is just mean annual temperature for all these different spots here, and there's like precipitation, there's like average high, the hottest quarter, and all these different climate, all this climate data. And what it does is it takes all this climate data and say, okay, here's all the places they are. Here's all the conditions that they really seem to like. Here are the conditions they don't seem to like. And it uses an algorithm to determine where the bird likely was based on the conditions it seemed to prefer. So I made this model, and using this climate data and using the occurrence data that I had collected, and here's the results. So the map here shows, here in blue is the western subspecies, the Ludovicianus, and then the eastern subspecies here, the carolinensis. And there's a little bit of overlap between the two here. And this model, you could see here this black line where I superimposed the original range estimate from 1891. You could see here that it's in my opinion, severely overestimates their range. And given that they were never seen here in the Ozarks, never seen in the Appalachians, rarely seen outside of the coast of the East Coast here, I feel this model way better represents the actual range of the Carolina parakeet than just taking a Sharpie, drawing a circle around the most extreme points. And to me, this helps make their extinction make a little bit more sense, because they're like a large range species. It's hard for them to go to extinct. It's not that they don't, but it's harder for them than a small range species. So this made sense to me. And then I started using these models to look at the amount that they may have shifted their range seasonally. So what I did is I subsetted the data that I collected into breeding in winter, and I ran these models again, and then I did what's called an ordinal niche comparison to see if the range in the summer, which you see here is the purple plus the orange, and the winter, which is the purple plus the blue, if it was what we call significantly different, as meaning that the difference is significant enough to suggest that it's actually true. And so you see here the number here, what this is called Shiner's D. And what this means is the closer you are to 1, the more perfect overlap you have, and the closer to 0 is maximum no overlap at all. So in this finding was significant, suggesting that they did in fact shift their range. And comparing this to the red-headed woodpecker, it actually is very similar, the range shift there. But then again, I did this for the eastern subspecies, and unsurprisingly, there is very little difference and between the two, suggestion that they probably didn't move, but it's Florida and they probably didn't need to deal with the cold. So there's the findings that we found there of their range and whether or not they shifted seasonally. And again, this really made sense to me because of the whole fact that they went extinct. And in their extinction is really rather remarkable, because in around 1800, that's when John James Audubon said, that's when we started noticing a decline. They seemed fine before then, but around 1800, they were starting to become more rare. And then by 1900, they were really just relegated to these very small remnant populations in very out of the way, hard to reach areas. So in 100 years, you had a species that, had a big chunk of half of the US as their range suddenly blink out in about 100 years. And I mean, to me, it's a mystery. Like people have ideas about why they went extinct. So for instance, here's a photo here of a woman with a hat that has an entire Carolina parakeet on it and some other bird, which I don't know, maybe a heath hen or something, who knows. So these birds were collected for the millinery trade, just like a lot of other birds like egrets. But there's no real estimate of how many Carolina parakeets are trapped for their feathers. They were also popular pets. They didn't breed well in captivity, from what I've read. And this is one of the only 2 photos of a living Carolina parakeet. This one's name is Doodles. And here's the other only photograph that I'm aware of a living Carolina parakeet. And so they were collected as pets, but they were also had a complicated relationship with farmers. So this individual parakeet here is on a cocklebur plant, and they like to eat cockleburs, which farmers hated. They were a weed, they were annoying, but the Carolina parakeets would eat their seeds. So some farmers really loved them for that. Other farmers, especially ones who had apple orchards, didn't, because they like to eat apple seeds. So they had a tendency to eat the seeds out of the apple, but drop the flesh of the apples on the ground. And as you can imagine, an apple farmer would not like that. And there's this really famous anecdote that Audubon relates about this apple farmer who just shot so many Carolina parakeets, and the Carolina parakeets, being a parrot and being a gregarious and social animal, would cry for help, and other Carolina parakeets would come. And so the farmer just shot them until he got tired of shooting them. And so that's a very lurid account. And that particular account, I think, accounts for the fact that most people think that we hunted them to death, which I don't necessarily agree with. But that account is really vivid and it sticks in people's minds. Another potential reason for their extinction is disease. And so the thinking here is, even though there's no direct evidence of it, the thinking here is that since the Carolina parakeets did like to hang out near farms, they would have come into close contact with domesticated poultry, like chickens. And so the thinking is parrots are notoriously susceptible to disease among birds. And, being that the Carolina parakeets were over here in North America and may have been introduced to some disease from Europe through the domesticated poultry, but there again, there's some accounts of individual Carolina parakeets having seizures, but but there's never been any study on what disease, if any, was responsible for their extinction. And lastly, one of the major ones, and ones that people usually associate with extinction, is habitat loss. And given what was going on in the 1800s in the US with the expansion of agriculture, it seems like a reasonable hypothesis. So here's the extent of agriculture in 1810, with the yellow and red being the like high intensity, where blue being like closer to blue is the closer to none. So here you have 1810. Then in the 40 years, you have a substantial growth of agriculture in the US. And then by 1900, it's pretty much everywhere. And then by 1930, it's just even more intense and spreading out into the West there. So it seems like a reasonable hypothesis. However, the Carolina parakeet, as I said before, seemed to be more of a habitat specialist of like swampy bottomland hardwood forest, which, especially the swamps, were probably the last place people would actually convert to farmland because it's just difficult. So the last sightings that we have of the Carolina parakeet that are, that seem to be real are in the late 1920s in the Kissimmee Prairie in Florida, which was a huge swamp before Disney was there. And the lower Santee River in South Carolina, which had reputable sightings by like professional observers that were there actually looking for ivory-billed woodpeckers up into the late 1930s. And so to try to think about, okay, when did this species go extinct? Because that was one of my questions. So what I did was I compiled all the data that I collected and broke them out into, like, for every year, did we have an observation? Did we actually have a specimen collected? Or did we have kind of like a controversial observation where it may have been somebody who had collected an egg that said it was a Carolina parakeet, but it may have been something else. And the reason I did this is there's a modeling technique, which is called extinction estimation models, which work essentially like this. If you have a species that you see once every 50 years, and suddenly you see one in, say, like 2010, but you don't see another one for another 30 years, does that mean that the one you saw in 2010 was the final one and they went extinct at that date? Versus a species you see every single year for 100 years, and then suddenly you don't see it again in 2010. It seems way more likely that the one you saw every year and then stopped seeing, that their extinction date was probably around 2010. But the one that you only saw every 50 years because it's cryptic or living in an area nobody goes, it seems unlikely. It seems likely they're still around. And that's basically how these models work. And you can use data with different levels of confidence. Like if you have a specimen, you have a bird in your hand that was shot in like 1870 versus, somebody saw it in 1870 versus somebody who's not really trustworthy saw it in 1870. Well, in this, so I took the best evidence in every year and I ran it for both subspecies. And so here's the western subspecies, the Ludovicianus, and here's the eastern subspecies. I chunked out the data just the same. And then I ran these models. And so on the top part here, you could see just another representation of the data that went into these models. And on the bottom here, you can see the estimates of their likely extinction date. So for the eastern subspecies here in green, It's extremely likely that they went extinct somewhere in 19, or I think it's around 1915 or so. And the eastern subspecies here in orange it was likely either in the mid 1940s or late 1930s. And if you considered all the records together, you would have somewhere around like 19, I think it's around 1942 or something like that. And so this shows two really interesting things to me, is that the subspecies went extinct roughly 30 years apart, even though the western subspecies had a much bigger range. And if I just ignored the differences in subspecies, I would just assume that they went extinct, that the entire species went extinct here. And I may have lost some information that may help determine why they went extinct or how they went extinct. So to try to get at this question of how did they go extinct? What drove them to extinct? What was the most important thing? Me and a few of my colleagues started working on this thing we call spatial extinction date estimation. Now, I want to provide a caveat that this is currently not finished. So the results I'm about to show you are preliminary and not final, but they are rather intriguing. So what we did was we took that species, that extinction date model, and we made it spatial. And so essentially what we did was we took every point in their range and grabbed all the points around it and estimated an extinction date for that one particular like grid cell on the map. And we did that 1,000 times, randomly selecting all the closest ones in different combinations, and then created an average extinction date for that grid cell, and which produced this map, which doesn't look very, it's hard to kind of interpret, but the redder ones are earlier extinctions and the bluer ones are later extinctions. But to make it more easy to really grasp, I animated it. And so what you're seeing here is their range contraction over time based on our model. So, you know, starting in 1840, you have their full range, and then you start seeing a pattern of the western subspecies kind of disappearing. And then by the end there, you just have a little bit left down in Florida and in here. So thinking about like, how do I prove that this model is accurate? I've remembered this old map that we had here from 1891. And on this map, it has these areas here where the author thought the birds still were at that time. So using this model, I just cut out where it said that the bird should be in 1891 on this model, which you see the eastern subspecies here in green, the western subspecies here in blue. And these black outlines here are the estimates based on 1891 map. And then these little X's here are sightings of the Carolina parakeet after 1890. So looking at this, it seems like my model better estimated the occurrence of Carolina parakeets after 1890, meaning that's probably their range at the time, than his estimation. So it gave me confidence the model is probably pretty good. And so in thinking about this, we ran some preliminary analyses to look at range loss, and it doesn't appear that there's correlation with the range contraction over time and the growth of agriculture, because there was no correlation between, well, this area was like pristine, and then suddenly there's agriculture, and then the bird left that particular area. And so we thought that habitat loss probably wasn't a major factor. And like looking at this again, we thought about like, wow, like this seems like pretty fast. Like, you know, like I was talking about how they went from 1800 to being widely ranged in the, you know, the eastern half of the US to being almost gone by 1900. We started thinking about, well, what was the velocity? How much of their range were they losing every year during that 100 years or so? And So we did based on the model that I just presented. So what we have here is the percentage of the original range that they lived in essentially as time progressed. So, starting here in 1800, where you had pretty much their entire range, this is how they lost their range over time. So the blue line here is the Ludovicianus, the Western subspecies. And you can see here that they lose pretty steadily, almost almost a straight line between like 1820 and 1900 with a few little wiggles here. And then the Eastern subspecies didn't really start losing range until the Western subspecies was almost already gone, for all intents and purposes. But then it had a little bit more of a more dramatic loss here of range size. And to make this a little bit more clear, because they had very different range sizes to begin with, the Eastern and Western, and we were just looking at proportions in that last one. This is the actual range loss over time in square kilometers per year. So you can see here, the blue again represents the Western subspecies. And you can see here that at its peak, based on our model, that the Western subspecies was losing approximately over 40,000 square kilometers a year. That number just blows my mind. I mean, that is such a large area to lose. And then looking at the Eastern subspecies, even though it had a much smaller range, they still got up to about 25,000 square kilometers at this one point here prior to 1900. And just as a note here, that at this time, between 1890 and 1900, people realized that the bird was going extinct. People who worked at natural history museums and hunters and egg collectors all realized that, oh, they're on their way out. So the natural history museums were like, oh, we need to get some specimens. So you see a huge uptick in the number of specimens collected in the 1890s. The egg collectors and the hunters kind of were like, this is it. And, help them along, I guess. But at that point, it was already a foregone conclusion that they were going to go extinct. So the velocity of range contraction, at least in my mind, points to it that it was probably disease. Because if we were, actually, let me step back. It was likely that all of these things contributed. But just one of them is likely, aside from maybe disease, couldn't account for the velocity of range contraction over time. Disease is likely the only thing that I think that can have caused that the rapidness of that kind of decline, with all the other things kind of aiding it along. But we still don't have an answer. And a recent paper came out where some genomicists said that because they sampled one individual bird and found no evidence of disease, that disease isn't the cause, which I strongly disagree with. But I guess they're entitled to their opinion. But still, there's no evidence for any of these, strong evidence anyway. And we may never know. It's really hard studying something that disappeared like 80, 90 years ago. And all of the information that exists now. You can't go out and collect more information. So trying to put together this puzzle over the last 10 years has been both incredibly amazing that I've been able to learn so much about this species that disappeared so long ago, but incredibly frustrating. And that's kind of the way science goes. There's failure is a constant in science. And I set out with these lofty goals of being the one who finally figures it out. And I may never be, or maybe someone else will, I don't know. But after 10 years, I'm still a little closer to having a good idea, but I still don't know what it is. And that's just kind of where I am right now. Just kind of hoping that one day I figure it out, but accepting that I may not. And so with that, that is the end of my talk, and I'm happy to take any questions you may have. All right. So we do have some questions here. Is it possible that some of the historic records actually refer to tropical parrots escaped from captivity? That is a good question. The answer to that question is it's possible that maybe a handful of them are, but it's unlikely that many, because parrots as pets were not really, during the time that the Carolina parakeet existed, they weren't like such a prominent pet that everybody had them, or like as many people had them as we do now. So it's possible that some of them were, but when I was going over the records, I purposely excluded the ones that had very vague descriptions of the bird. So I was reasonably sure that all, if not most of them, if not all of them, were actually Carolina parakeets. I mean, they are quite distinctive for parrots, and they are distinctive from other things, other birds in North America. Let's see. Someone said Christopher Hope would suggest that European honeybees may have played a role in their extinction. Yes, that is a people have discussed that in the literature as being a potential cause. It certainly may have happened to some extent, and the ancillary kind of a problem of honey hunters actually chopping down the trees that had all these cavities that may have also had both bees and the Carolina parakeets. The issue there though is that the honeybees and the Carolina parakeets prefer different size cavities. So it's likely that it may have happened, but I don't think it was so prevalent that it was the driving factor or even a major factor. Let's see, specimen gathered to test for disease. No, usually the specimens were just shot and skinned. So I have been talking to people who study like disease, and people who do looking at DNA of specimens to see if there's a way to try to collect maybe viral or bacterial DNA from the specimens. But sadly, not many of the Carolina parakeet specimens were collected and put into alcohol. It's like whole specimens. They were mostly just turned into like basically their skins, the specimens that are just their skin, or maybe they're just a skeleton, or both. But very few like alcohol preserved specimens remain. In fact, I don't really think there are that many, if probably less than 5. Do Carolina parakeets have any living relatives? Yes, they do. Their most closely related species to the Carolina parakeet are the Nande conure and the sun conure. And the sun conure actually does look, they have a very similar head. So those are their 2 closest living relatives. Is anything known about their mating habits? I haven't read a lot about their mating habits. They have like these really interesting behaviors, like which I didn't really cover, but they roosted communally. So you can imagine in the cold that them huddling all up in one like cavity in a tree would help with, maintain their body temperature and everything like that. But they had a really unique way of sleeping where they would stick their bills into wood or whatever, and they would hang from their bills while they slept. So there's barns in Florida where they used to roost very consistently in these barns, where they would hang themselves from the beams of the barn, and they slept there so much that there was actually indentations into the wood from their beaks while they were hanging down and sleeping. So that's just pretty cool. But their mating habits, I've not read much about it, and And given that they try to breed them in captivity, I'm really surprised that nobody really wrote a lot. I mean, maybe there's a trove of literature somewhere in some random library in Europe or something somewhere where somebody wrote about it, but I have yet to find anything. Let's see. Have I heard the story about Alexander Hamilton's daughter that had one as a pet in his office at the Grange homestead? No, I have not heard that story. So that's interesting. I'll look into that. Thank you, Therese. Let's see. Let's see. Dick here. I noticed a peak in range contraction from the eastern subspecies in about 1890. That seems to coincide with the peak of market gunning, especially for shorebirds. You seem to imply that hunting wasn't a major factor, but have you any evidence of parakeets being sold for food? That's an interesting question. The answer to that is no. People are afraid of Carolina parakeets because they may have been poisonous or toxic. There's accounts of people's cats eating them and then dying after. And considering that some of the foods they ate were toxic, it could be that they built up in the paper I referred to where the genomicists studied it, found that they actually had a genetic adaptation for being able to digest these toxic foods. And the thinking is that they incorporated, it was in their bodies essentially. So if you ate it, you could die. So people may have eaten them, but it was definitely not like a big thing that's been written about anyway. Do you think a North American parakeet would able to thrive in modern day? So that's another really good question. So there's the whole question of de-extinction, where the general premise is kind of like Jurassic Park, where you take the DNA and you create, in a lab essentially, a replicate of the species that has disappeared. It's obviously more complicated than that. But there are people who consider the Carolina parakeet to be an ideal candidate for de-extinction. And the fact that we don't really know what drove them extinct, like for instance, if it was a disease, like I think it probably was, that disease may still be out in the environment. And if we don't know what it is, we could spend all this time, energy, and effort and money in trying to bring this species back, only to release them out and have them contact a couple of chickens, and then they're all dead. So I feel that it's certainly possible. I mean, monk parakeets seem to be thriving perfectly well in North America right now. But whether or not the Carolina parakeet would thrive, I don't know. I don't know if the habitat really exists that they need. But there's just a lot of questions I would have before somebody actually really went and did this for real. Let's see. Amir asked, was the poaching involved with extinction? Their poaching involved with extinction? Yeah. I mean, they were poached, like I said, about like the farmers who shot them. There were the people who poached them for pets. And I'm sure all of that contributed to their extinction for sure. You mentioned that monk parakeets might fill the same niche. Jamie asked if monk parakeets might fill the same ecological niche as the Carolina parakeets. Is that justification for removing laws from the monk parakeets? I can't really speak to the laws because I'm not a politician. However, I will say that the Carolina parakeet and the monk parakeet are very different species. They eat very different things. They live in very different habitats. And I don't think that you could say that the monk parakeet is a replacement for the Carolina parakeet. Because if you look at the range of the Carolina parakeet and the range of the monk parakeets in North America, they're almost mirrors of one another, where the Carolina, except in Florida, they both love Florida. But the Carolina parakeet was a woodland creature. It lived in the swamps, it lived in the woods. Whereas the monk parakeet is a shrubland bird and lives in grassy areas. It lives in, the Pampas region of Brazil, which is kind of like a grassy area where there's a lot of livestock grazing. So, so I don't think that they're an actual replacement. They're just very different species. Whether or not that has any bearing on laws, I don't have any comment on. All right. Let's see. There's some in the oh wait, Todd has a question here. It seems like the Carolina parakeet's shared habitat type and nesting cavities needs somewhat with the ivory-billed woodpecker, which I've always understood to have gone extinct due to habitat loss. If that's true, why do you imagine the habitat loss for the ivory-bill was not as big of a variable for the parakeet? I mean, that's a good question. I think, I mean, they are different species that have very different needs. But they did seem to live in overlap a lot in habitat type. I'm not an expert on the ivory-billed woodpecker, so I can't really speak to the similarities between the two. I'm just, based on my analyses here and all the reading I've done about Carolina parakeets, I've concluded that habitat loss is not the major driver. But again, it may possibly well. I don't know for sure. It just doesn't seem to me, based on what the data I've analyzed and the reading that I've done on it, that it was the determining factor. But I could be wrong for sure. Let's see. I think there's some. Do we have? Oh, there's some in the chat. Oh, somebody asked about the monk parakeets, Carolina parakeets. All right. Does anybody have any other questions? It seems not. Okay. Well, if you do have any questions, if something occurs to you, or if you have any ideas, alternate theories, by all means, please email me here, and I'll be happy to talk to you about it. All right. I guess that's a wrap. All right, everybody.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Have a good evening, and be sure to check out some of our upcoming events, and we will hopefully see you all there. Take care. Bye. And thank you, Kevin, too.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.